Good morning, everyone. I'll just give a quick introduction. Jennifer works at NiSource. She is a Senior Vice President and Chief Customers Officer for NiSource, the natural gas and electric utility that we're all very fond of. Thank you, Jennifer, for all the power that you provide us. She is responsible for setting direction and managing a leadership team focused on customer experiences in 7 states. It's amazing. I don't know how you do all that. She joined the company as Vice President of Communication and External Affairs in November 2018. Prior to joining NIPSCO, Jennifer had nearly 3 decades of customer operations, branding, communication, and marketing experience with ComEd, British Petroleum, Amoco, and in England and in Warrenville, Illinois. She has a bachelor's degree in quantitative economics and feminist studies from Stanford and a master's of business administration from the University of Chicago. She's based in Maryville. She's currently on vacation. And Jennifer, how kind of you to spend a few minutes with us sharing your leadership journey. As I love to say, we're all works in progress, and we hope today that some of your wisdom that you share with us will help all of us on our journey. So thank you, Jennifer, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sheila. So I really want to thank you all for coming today, and I'm really glad to be in conversation with Purdue Northwest. And as Sheila said, I apologize in advance if my screen freezes up. So I have somebody who's going to text me to tell me to turn off my camera if that happens. And I really want to spend some time talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm really passionate about this area, and I've been in corporate America for 30 years. And I feel like, you know, corporate America has been working on diversity and inclusion really for the past 30 years or so. Thanks so much. Okay, thank you. Okay, so Sheila did a great job of doing an introduction, embarrassed me a little bit, but I did want to say that you know, in terms of corporate America, I've been working for 30 years. First at BP Amoco, a lot of you all are familiar with that, and then with ComEd, which is a utility in Chicago, and now at NiSource. And I've had a wide variety of roles, and every place where I've worked, I've served on a variety of diversity inclusion councils, and I've participated in leaderships in ERGs over the past years at every place I've worked. And I would say, though, across corporate America, there hasn't been much change in diversity and inclusion. They were talking about it 30 years ago. We're still talking about some of the same things. And so that's why I really love this recent quote that you see from Mellody Hobson right here. Now, Mellody Hobson is the co-CEO and president of Ariel Investments. And she and I are actually the same age, and we're from a similar area in Chicago. And she says, I've been calling, uh-oh, here I froze. Okay, hold on a second. I'm gonna turn my camera off. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so great. So you know, Mellody Hobson says, I've been calling this civil rights 3.0. And this problem is at the feet of corporate America. And I've been saying we need less lip service, we need more elbow grease. And this is really this time is going to be different because we live in a society that's going to hold us accountable. There's no way to escape this without actually having real results now. And people are watching. Now, Mellody Hobson made this statement following, there was an announcement in December of 2020 from NASDAQ that NASDAQ is going to push for much greater diversity at the board level. And there are more than 3,000 companies that are listed on its exchange. And they basically made a NASDAQ announcement that every corporate board needs to have a woman or a person of color listed on their board level. And I can't remember the time, but over the next 3 years or so. And really that's to really propel corporations towards diversity and inclusion. Again, I indicated at the beginning, I've been working in corporate America for 30 years. We've been having the same conversations for 30 years. So today, I do really want to talk about, you know, how do we keep moving down the path of diversity and inclusion, and how do we have real results? So I do want to talk a little bit about NiSource's diversity, equity, and inclusion focus. And then I have a couple of slides to talk about what are citizens saying? What are they talking about? What are they saying really works? Because that's really some of the issue, right? We've been working on this for a long time. We haven't made a lot of headway. So, you know, here's some thoughts on what they're saying really works. And then I want to leave everyone here with a challenge, because everyone here is today, we're in a learning process, right? This is a leadership innovation institute. So we're here for learning. And I want to leave you with a challenge for you to take away with your own companies and your own constituencies. Okay, so the killing of George Floyd last year at the hands of police really kicked off a touch point in the United States. And it certainly was not the first police brutality death, but it was the one that broke something open, right? It really shifted the environment and it propelled and sustained nationwide protests over the treatment of African Americans. So the past year has really highlighted the need for society at large and corporations as a whole. And NiSource, we took this on specifically to examine and address racial equity, inclusion, and diversity. And I will say our CEO, Joe Hamrock, he made public statements that at NiSource we would have no tolerance for intolerance. And although we've been working on diversity and inclusion for quite some time at NiSource, we still have significant work to do. Now, I did want to start, we're a utility. So at the utility, we start each meeting with a safety moment. And so I wanted to start us today to talk about a safety moment. And this one is really around psychological safety, right? At utilities, we spend a lot of time talking about physical safety, as we should, but this is also around psychological safety. Now, the definition of psychological safety is basically the understanding that if you're open and honest, that's okay. And that you won't have negative, is everything okay? Okay, and that you won't have negative repercussions in your environment. So these pictures that you see here, they show people protesting from last summer. And they were protesting because they were fed up and they wanted immediate change. And they felt like their psychological safety had been compromised a long time. Now, this picture actually includes some people from our NiSource family. They're not just internet pics. They include 2 pics of my coworkers, daughter and son, protesting for more equity. But if we go back to psychological safety, the reason why this is so hardwired is that we have a little small part in our brain that's called the amygdala. And that's really our brain's radar for threat, right? So we're hardwired, with thousands of years, we're hardwired to either fight or to flight, run away, or to freeze when we perceive a threat. And so that's, human beings were hardwired that way. If we saw a saber-toothed tiger, we would either, fight it, we'd run away, or we'd freeze. And even though saber-toothed tigers became extinct thousands of years ago, our brain still perceives all threats as threats that could harm or kill us. So we've evolved over time, but our brain really still acts in that same way when we experience new situations that could trigger us. So I can just say, as an African American, when I'm in a situation where I experience racism, or I'm in an environment where I feel like I'm not safe, right? It lacks safety. It puts me in survival mode, right? So my brain perceives it as a threat, and the amygdala, takes control. And we, as human beings, we either respond by fighting, so we get into an argument, we run, like we walk away, or we freeze and we say nothing. And I would say personally for myself, I usually end up freezing. Or fighting, it depends. So now this is the reason why this is important to work, is because racism experiences over time will compromise your best performance, right? So you're not going to deliver your best self, right? You're going to hold back. And so unless we've actually spent time working on our triggers, and that's hard work, we won't be giving our best performance. Now, I said earlier, my personal triggers really range from either racism, or in situations where I'm being condescended to, or situations where I feel like people are just out and out, don't respect me or don't respect people on my team. So those are like my personal triggers. And so unless we work on those in a productive manner, it can really prevent us from innovating or learning new things. But the good news the flip side of that is when you feel like you've got a safe area where you can share your thoughts, where your voice is heard, that actually increases psychological safety. So, and then when you see the changes happening because of what you shared, it increases any more. And then you feel like, okay, I can really be my authentic self, I can be more self-aware, and I can be more influential. So when you feel safe, you're able to shut down that brain's hardwiring for defensiveness, and that fosters that healthy risk-taking, that innovation, and really enables us to unleash fuller strengths. Now, I said earlier that as a utility, we spend a lot of time focused on physical safety, as we should. That's our #1 priority. But we are also dedicated to creating an environment of psychological safety at NiSource. So last summer, we set off by having a series of coffee chats with each ERG. And we started with LEAD, which is the African American ERG. Now, our CEO, Joe Hamrock, he ended up holding facilitated conversations with 4 ERGs and about 430 people in 2020 and 2 ERGs in 2021. And the topics were really on culture, specifically that whole conversation that I held around psychological safety and what our current inclusive leadership needs, as well as what employees feel like they can own and what they feel like they can be responsible towards fostering an inclusive environment. Jason, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So how did employees take this? So first off, they were glad for the engagement. They felt more connected and like they were heard. And they thought that this was a step in the direction of no tolerance for intolerance. Now, specifically in terms of culture, we heard a lot of different words, but the consistent word we heard was that we're improving, meaning that we're not there, but that we're improving. And I will say in terms of psychological safety, when we started the coffee chats, psychological safety, frankly, was low. And our goal was to get higher. Now, it was important to note that we weren't just doing this for the sake of a number. We really wanted people to feel safe so they could bring, all of their strengths to work. And it's also important to know that for African Americans, the reports were much lower in terms of how we feel about psychological safety and how we feel about culture. And those, I would say, mirrored the sentiments within our society and nation. Specifically last summer, but I would also say that's, may have carried forward towards now.
It is.
So can somebody go on mute? Thanks. So I'd say it also confirmed, Joe specifically asked to start the conversations with African-American employees. And again, we held the other conversations with, a variety of ERGs, but it's important for us to start realizing, even though we hear some things that aren't always comfortable, it's important for us to position ourselves to learn how to become more comfortable with the uncomfortable. I would say also employees really appreciated the fact that NiSource is accountable to our diversity, equity, inclusion commitment as a business imperative. But they wanted that confirmation that that commitment was consistent below the executive level, right? So they really wanted to make sure all leaders were accountable and engaged in inclusive leadership behaviors. And then lastly, they wanted clear action. Like, what are we going to do actually? So for example, employees wanted more transparency within hiring, promotion, and developmental opportunities, and particularly those hiring, promotion, and developmental opportunities for women and people of color. And they wanted more diversity, equity, and inclusion training and a continued commitment to ERGs. So over the years, this was originally from NIPSCO, but over the years, NiSource has invested heavily in diversity and inclusion, and we're on a continuous journey. So this highlights sort of the strategy that we have at current. And our aspirations are to have diverse representation in our workforce at all levels, to have leaders who cultivate a culture of inclusion, and to have transparency and equity in talent management. So the strategy that we want to take to deliver that is really in the 4 circles at the bottom, right? We want to enhance our current efforts with our ERGs and our state IND councils to help them become greater enablers of the business. We want to build inclusive leadership to foster an inclusive environment. We want to infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion into talent management and development. And we're doing that through formal mentoring programs for women and people of color. But we also request attendance at national conferences like ABE, which is the American Association for Blacks in Energy, WINUP, which is the Women's International, I'm gonna mess up. It's the Women's International Network, I can't remember what the UP stands for, and MIA, which is the Midwest Energy Association, Energetic Women. And then lastly, we also wanted to drive diverse talent acquisition by partnering with organizations to really make sure that we're driving more diverse talent with our opportunities, and by revamping the process to eliminate hiring biases. So that's focused on things like making sure that you have a diverse panel when you're interviewing candidates, and also requiring diverse candidate slates. Okay, now I would like to note on the last slide, I sort of said that was our current diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. But I also want to note that for NiSource, in the past maybe 6 months, we had 3 members of the diversity, equity, inclusion team, and they all found terrific opportunities outside of the organization. So 1 person retired, and then 2 people took external roles. So we are in the process of completely rebuilding the function and creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion center of excellence. And that will focus on things like leadership, best practices, analytics, training, and support. So we're currently in the search mode for a chief diversity, equity, inclusion leader. And as you can imagine, that's really a competitive field currently. So although we do have a strategy that we have been working on for some time within NiSource, we really do expect that the new team, this new center of excellence, will come in, and there may be many elements of the framework that remain, like being leader driven, but this is our opportunity right now to ask for what's more, and how do we really accelerate our thinking. Now, in the meantime, we know that we will do some certain things, right? We'll do things like continuing our coffee chats, because those have been successful for us and really allowed people to get issues on the table and allow us to start working on those. We've also we will be working with the ERGs on their 2021 action plan, and have a session scheduled in April for that with our EVP. And we're also creating an advocate council to identify, with our communications team, working with them to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to learn from others who are further along on their journey. And I think one of the most exciting things we did is we focused on an incentive modifier for, so this is a magnifier for diversity, equity, inclusion, to really reinforce our expectations of leaders on a workforce metric composition. And this is really because, we're putting our money where our mouth is, right? I had a boss who used to say, what gets measured gets done. And so we are actually baking this into an incentive plan for officers to really focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. So that's a little bit about NiSource journey and some of the things that we're working on. So again, you've heard that we've made some really great progress, but we do have a ways to go. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are leading companies out there who are taking steps to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, but progress in most sectors really remains tepid, right? There have been programs to increase diversity and inclusion in the workplace for, I can say, at least 30 years. And sometimes they offer what actually is working. So there was a Stanford professor and a Harvard professor, and they convened a symposium on what's actually working to improve diversity and inclusion in organizational life. And David Padula, who was one of the professors, wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review on it last year. And it's entitled Diversity and Equity Inclusion Efforts That Really Work. And so I just want to highlight a few things that he highlighted in the article. So first off, organizations should set goals, right? They should end up collecting data, setting goals, and really hold people accountable for improving diversity within the organization. So I said earlier that I had a boss who used to say, what gets measured gets done. And I'll also add, what gets incented really gets done in spades. So, our example, NiSource's example of adding this magnifier to really get our executives focused on how do we increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's an example of that, right? Setting goals, collecting the data, and holding people accountable. The second thing, and I find this really interesting, so this one is organizations should abandon traditional discrimination and harassment reporting systems. So this is interesting because, they're saying that half of complaints lead to retaliation. And workers who complain are more likely to end up facing career challenges or experiencing worse mental or physical health compared to similar workers who were harassed, but did not complain about this. So what they're recommending is they're recommending expanding. Most organizations have what's called EAP programs, right? The employee assistance plans. And they're recommending to expand the scope of EAP plans to include discrimination and harassment, and to add ombuds offices and transformative dispute resolution systems to play a critical role in not only reducing retaliation, but also provide the fuel for organizational change. And again, I find that concept really interesting, because I do know, I've experienced at times in my career where I felt as if I was in a situation where I was not being treated well. It was a toxic situation, but I felt fear. I didn't feel as if it was something that I could report, because I had seen exactly that thing. I'd seen that people who ended up reporting faced much harder career challenges, and it shouldn't be that way. But I know that many women, many people of color often do feel that way. So that's why I feel like that's an interesting, I really feel like that's an interesting solution to look at in terms of EAP and expanding EAP and make those into ombuds programs. Third thing is organizations. So organizations should check to make sure that the technologies that they use in hiring and promotion aren't inherently biased. So employers need to build solutions with an eye to screening out discrimination, and then checking for it on the back end to make sure that biases haven't crept back into their system. So what I imagine this is, I'm on the board, I sing, and I'm on the board for Merit School of Music. And one of the things that I have seen with orchestras is they've started having blind admissions to try to, I'm sorry, not admissions, blind interviews to try to improve the number of African-American, Latino, basically people of color that they have playing in symphonies, right, across the nation. I think the number of people of color playing in symphonies is really low, like 2%. So they're trying to improve that, and they're trying to change those biases. And they basically have indicated that if they have those blind interviews, that the chances of people of color getting in increases. So I think that's one example. There are other technologies in terms of artificial intelligence, which are built in terms of screening out people. There are also things in terms of people's names, people's addresses. So anyway, those are just some examples. The fourth is companies must avoid tokenism. And I think this one is big too, right? When individuals are underrepresented, so people of color, there may be subject to bias, and that has negative consequences. So to combat that, companies need to add a larger number of diverse, underrepresented individuals, so they're not the one and only. So it never feels fun to be the one and only, but if you get 3 or 4, then you really feel like you're more part of the group, more engaged. And so, focusing on how to add a larger number of diverse, underrepresented individuals so they don't feel isolated. And if people are isolated, they're easy to discount. It's easy not to pay attention to the recommendations and thoughts of somebody if they're the one and only. And the other thing is to increase visibility by providing more opportunities, like presentation at a conference or presentation at a really important really important project for the company. Getting people staffed on really special, high visibility projects. So provide more of those opportunities to people. And then the last thing is organizations should get managers and leaders really involved in diversity programs from the start to increase this buy-in and leading to a smooth implementation. So this needs to be something that everyone in the organization feels bought into. It can't just be, we actually heard this in our feedback too, it can't just be the senior executives who feel that way. It really has to be everyone in the organization. So I've talked a little bit about what we're doing at NiSource. I talked a little bit about, what academics are saying, this is what really works. And I want to leave you with, I want to issue a challenge. So we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd. And, last week we also saw, 6 Asian women, so a total of 8 lives, who were murdered in Atlanta. So we know that racism still exists, right? And so I want you to think about, what are you personally doing? Oh, I'm sorry, and let me name the names of the 6 Asian women. Soo-Jung Park, Hyen Jung Grant, San Chai Kim, Yo Ayaye, Delana Ashley Huan, Paul Andre Michaels, Zhao Ji Tan, and Dao Yufeng. So they were all murdered in Atlanta. So I want you all to think about personally what you're personally doing to advance diversity, equity, inclusion. And I want you to think about it through 2 lenses. So first, what specifically are you doing to do it at your company? And then specifically, what are you doing in your community? And I don't mean like, what book are you reading in your book club? Because, lots of people rush to, oh, we're going to read White Fragility in our book club, which education is great. Self-education is super important, right? But I want to know, like, what are you actually doing? And if you don't know, or if you haven't made a choice of what you're actually doing to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in your company, or just in your community, then I challenge you to make a choice of what action you're going to take. And I'm challenging you to do it really by the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, which is May 20th, right? Because all of us on this call, we're all leaders, and we're accountable for real results. And if you think back to Melody Hobson's quote, at this point in the country, we need elbow grease and we need real effort, because people are watching and they're holding us accountable. So thank you. Now I just want to, at this point, turn it over for questions.
So Jennifer, I can help out with that if you'd like.
Thank you. I would appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I love the quote, "What gets measured gets done," because we all know life gets so busy that we kind of lose ourselves in the busyness of it. But there's a couple of really important questions. The first question is, how do you handle a situation when you do not have a safe area? So could you share some of your strategies? You mentioned that you, at one point in your career, were in a toxic environment. And I'm sure a lot of our learning comes from difficulties and difficult experiences. So perhaps you could share some strategies, some of the things that perhaps you've learned to handle situations like that, so that you can advance your career and all of the things that you mentioned with still keeping true to yourself.
Yes. So I'll speak about, when I worked at my last company, I at one point had worked for a boss who was, he was verbally abusive. He spent, I worked for him for 2.5 years. He called me stupid, like literally called me stupid. He would spend time, not only, yelling or whatever, but he would slam the door. He would stand over me menacingly at meetings. He would bang on the table. He would instruct me I couldn't speak in meetings. If we were going into a meeting with people, externally, he would tell me that I couldn't speak because he thought I was a bad manager. And it was really from an emotional standpoint, it was very difficult because I did a lot of second guessing of myself. And I literally would go home and have conversations with my husband or my mentor, and I would say, okay, I know I may be a lot of things, but I'm pretty sure stupid isn't one of them. And so I had to spend a lot of time what's the word I'm looking for? I had to spend a lot of time sort of revalidating for myself that I wasn't stupid, right? Because he kept calling me stupid. And I also then separately spent a lot of time realizing, okay, if I'm not able to get him to think that I have value, where else in the organization can I be adding value? Where else can I provide value for the organization? So I started speaking at a ton of external conferences in areas where I had expertise. So I was speaking at conferences on billing and payment, new billing and payment strategies that we were focusing on the utility. I was speaking at low income strategy conferences, and I started to that. And then also I was working on a number of different projects that were winning awards for the utility. So we ended up revamping our bill, and we won awards for that. So I started realizing, okay, because I recognized pretty early on that I couldn't change his mind. And so I was like, okay, where else can I get validation? I also then spent time developing relationships with other people within the company. So even though he was my direct boss, there were other people in the company who realized, okay, this guy's a little, bit of an asshole. I don't want to curse, but a bit of an ass. And so I started to develop those relationships. Now, I didn't feel comfortable. And again, this is on me, and back, hindsight is 2020. So should I have, gone to HR and filed an ethics complaint? I probably should have. That's probably what I should have done. I'll tell you what ended up happening was somebody else filed an ethics complaint on my behalf and basically said, I really feel like it's a hostile work environment. I hate it every time I go into a meeting with this person and Jennifer, and he's, hollering at her and telling her he's stupid and standing over her menacingly. It makes me uncomfortable. So somebody else ended up filing that ethics complaint. And then I ended up switching departments. But I will say in that moment, the work that I tried to do was to try to find safe spots for me outside of that place where I felt like I was oppressed, and places where I felt like I could provide value. Again, that was several years ago. That probably was not what I would have done now realizing that I have more self-confidence and awareness. Mm-hmm. That's a space that I was in. Is that responsive to the question, do you think, Sheila?
Yeah, I think that's great. There's a technical question from Earl Miller. Earl is the Chief of Innovation at Hyler Industries here in LaPorte County. He says, how did you design the psychological safety survey you used in order to get the most out of the metrics? So Earl spends a lot of time working on innovative teamwork with his employees, and just wanting to find out how did you design the survey so that you could really help change happen in the company?
Okay. So really, we asked 3 questions, and let me see if I can even find the question. I think we asked the question like how psychological. Hold on 1 second. I think the question was, we asked a question specifically about culture, like how do you describe culture at NiSource? The other question I think was really simple, like how psychologically safe do you feel? And it was on a scale of, I think it was a scale of 1 to 5, and it was based on strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. So those were the scales. And then we just collected the scores based on the number of people. And then the other questions we asked were around, what are the things that you feel like you need to increase your level? Oh, here is a question exactly. I feel I work in an environment of psychological safety at NiSource. And then the other questions we asked were around what psychological support is needed. And the last question was around what individual support do you need to improve the culture? So those are the kinds of questions that we asked. Does that help answer your question, Earl?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question about coping skills that you might have developed over your career through some of the experiences. And, a couple people have called out and said, they really appreciate you talking about the painful experiences, because, from our perspective as your viewers, you look extremely successful, on top of the world. And it's important for people to realize that we all have our journey. And so by sharing that journey with us, it really strengthens our own leadership journey. So thank you for that. But any coping skills you might want to share, Jennifer?
Yeah, well, so Sheila, so I'm a spiritual person, so I pray a lot. And you don't want to at work to have to go in to literally shut your office door and get down on your knees and pray. But I'm telling you, when I was going through that situation with that boss, I did have to a few times. And then also, just trying to having an external mentor. So I've had a variety of mentors throughout my career, but I've had mentors who were external to the company where I was, and I've had mentors within the company where I was. So having both of those, I think, have helped. And I spoke on this a little bit before, but having an external network of people who you can talk to, I think is useful, because you can. I see somebody said in the chat, workplace bullying is a real thing, and it is a real thing, unfortunately, and it can happen at the best of companies. And so unless the organization really does the work to make sure they're rooting that out, if you're in that situation, you have to figure out, okay, you almost feel like, okay, do I leave? Do I stay and try to see if I can change it, improve it? I did do, there's a really terrific book called For Your Improvement. And it actually talks about different ways that you can engage in conflict resolution. And so I tried a lot of those things up front, like, okay, well, he's feeling this way in terms of conflict. Perhaps I can, approach it in this way. So I tried all of those things. None of those worked. As a matter of fact, and sometimes it would make it worse. But you can, I do think if you can try first having a conversation with someone, and then once you realize that you're going down the road, and if that really isn't going to work, if the person is taking delight in bullying you or making you feel small, then you need to figure out, okay, how do I protect myself? I will say though, leaving isn't always the best. Sometimes leaving is the best response, sometimes it's not. So I think I really do think it just depends on the situation that you're in. Is that responsive to what you were asking, Sheila?
Yes, I think so. A couple people have asked about your use of the HR department. Do you suggest that when people have issues that they go to HR? Is that a good time?
I do. I'm torn on this. I do. But you also have to realize when, I mean, it depends on the situation you're in, right? In the situation that I was in, I didn't go to HR. I went to an SVP, and I sort of said, this isn't really working for me. Is there something, can I work in a different department? Is there something else I can do? And their response was, they got me a coach. And my coach was like, she met with me, she met with us. And then her response was, she went and had a conversation with HR, and she was like, actually, she's not the problem. The problem is her boss. He's the one who needs a coach. But sometimes HR, so it really depends where you work. Sometimes HR is really trying to root out difficulties and issues. Sometimes HR is trying to make sure that they protect the company as well. So there's a fine line to thread. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, that's great. There's a lot of HR questions, and one from a former Leadership Northwest Indiana participant, Mr. Washington. It's nice to see you. Do you have much confidence in the HR system if you would have filed yourself as an African-American woman? And do you feel that your confidence in the system was low as a result of your not filing? So he's trying to kind of understand how that went for you.
Oh, in the situation I was in? Mm-hmm. Well, I should complicate this by saying, in the situation I was in, my boss was an African-American male.
Oh, okay.
So part of and I realize that Jennifer had lots of personal stuff wrapped up into why I did not want to file with HR, right?
Sure.
Because I personally didn't want to end up negatively impacting an African-American male, because there were very few African-American male VPs. So I probably let it ride longer than I should have done. I don't know. I actually do think, had I gone to speak to them, I think HR would have worked sooner, would have moved me sooner, but I didn't, at that point, didn't feel comfortable. I also, though, had been other places, worked at other places where I saw someone did complain, and the mental toll that they went through was not worth them. The mental toll they went through afterwards was not worth them complaining and just trying to switch departments. So yeah. So it's not necessarily the confidence in HR. It's also, though, how HR manages, ethics complaints, right? They end up interviewing the entire department, right? If it's an issue between two people, right, then they end up interviewing 20 people to figure out what happened. And again, the mental exercise that goes in with it, the mental exercise where people are trying to figure out what's going on, is all of that. Now, let's be clear, I am not an HR professional. And I'm only speaking of my own, past experiences, and it is different at every company.
Right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Earlier on, you challenged us to create change in our own lives. And so I'm going to pass to Dr. Smith, who has a question about that challenge.
Yeah. Well, and I really wanted to thank you for leaving us with a challenge, because one of the things that we try to do in the Leadership Institute is always set something that we're going to try differently in the next period before we meet. So having that challenge is really helpful for us to be reflecting on our own behaviors and some of the things that we are doing right now or that we could be doing differently. And I really loved that you set it up in terms of not just the lip service, not just my book club is reading White Fragility, but where is our elbow grease? And I'll be honest, I felt challenged by that. I jotted down a few things. What am I doing right now at work? And what am I doing right now in my community? And it got me thinking, well, what else could I be doing? Do you have suggestions for us? What are some of the most impactful things that people could be doing to really be working against racism in their communities or in their organizations and working towards diversity, equity, and inclusion in those domains so that we can all be advocates for what is vitally important for our collective well-being?
Yeah, so I can say I serve on a few boards, and many of the nonprofit boards I serve on, the Lake Area United Way, the Merritt School of Music, are actually looking at anti-racism training. And they, as part of the training that they're going through, are thinking about having discussions and saying, are there any practices that we are, engaging in a regular basis that actually create a situation of inequity? And so you could think about that for your own corporation, right? You could say, are there any inherent practices that we are engaging in related to either hiring or supplier diversity, or I don't know, how you develop and set your curriculum, or what you determine is the most appropriate methodology. So those are types of examples that you can think about. There was I can't use it for reproduction because it came from a consultant, but the consultant actually had a really nice methodology on trying to determine how much of it was like a continuum on the level of anti-racist. It was an anti-racist continuum for your organization. So you can actually do that kind of work to help determine whether or not you are delivering that. So that's on a corporate basis. And then, on an internal basis, that one is harder. I'm trying to think of what you could do. I have a friend who, said, I'm going to actually start, I'm going to specifically start giving my business to, businesses of color. So, when last summer occurred and, racial inequities just became really crystal clear, she basically said, okay, something as simple as I'm going to stop, shopping at Nordstrom's and Macy's, and I'm going to start finding, African-American boutiques and clothing stores, and where I'm going to spend my money. Yeah. And actually, she's actually done that. So, I'm not saying that that's what you have to do, but you're going to have to figure out for yourself what the thing that you're going to do in your community is. But there are, if I can try to find on the phone this continuum, and again, I can't project it because I have to get permission for that.
Sure.
But let me see if I can find that. And maybe if we go to the next question, I can try to find that in a minute.
Well, and I'm just going to comment on your comments, and then we'll go to the next question. It looks like Mayor Germany has a question as well, but I think it's helpful to also be thinking about, ways to really be self-reflective and evaluate the systemic things that we are doing that we might our implicit bias, and which is something that we've asked our groups to take that measure and really reflect on the results on that, what they could do to impact the blind spots that they know their brain is already creating for them. So the systemic things are really important. And I worry, do you worry that we might spend too much time on things that are just on the surface, as if we're putting on a Band-Aid on something that is a systemic illness that really only, as an individual, doesn't allow us to have as much of an impact as we could if we were far more evaluating the root causes of some of the things that we personally do.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, Rachel. And I also think what's difficult for people is they feel like, okay, they want either their diversity, equity, inclusion program to be like, if you think about how you take care of your teeth, right? You brush and floss your teeth every day if you want to have a healthy, teeth, and you go to the dentist twice a year. Well, I think a lot of people want to think of their diversity, equity, inclusion program like, I'm just going to go to the dentist twice a year, but I'm not going to do anything else the rest of the time. I'm never gonna brush my teeth. And then they get upset if people say, okay, you know what, that behavior is not a diverse or inclusive behavior, but it's because we're not doing any active work on it. I don't want to say on a daily basis, but like we daily brush our teeth. Like we can't expect to eat and, put all kinds of crap in our mouth and not brush our teeth on a regular basis. And it's really that kind of thing. Okay, I found this continuum, but again, I can't project it because I don't have approval. But this continuum it says continuum on becoming an anti-racist institution, and it has different scales. So one is that you're a segregated institution, right? So most people are not this, but it basically says intentionally and publicly excludes African Americans, Arab Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos. Has an institutional racism. So I don't think most places are like that, right? And it talks about also has institutional policies, practices towards other oppressed groups like disabled, LGBTQ, elderly women. Then the next phase is a club institution. So it's tolerant of a limited number of people of color with proper perspective and credentials, but secretly wants to limit or exclude people of color. And then the next phase is symbolic. It's a multicultural institution, so it makes official policy pronouncements regarding that multicultural diversity, and it sees itself as non-racist, but it carries out intentional inclusive efforts, but it's really geared towards people who don't make waves, and it doesn't have good context in how their culture or policies and decision makers, and it's relatively unaware of continuing patterns of privilege, paternalism, and control. So I'd say if I'm honest, probably most organizations fall in that area. Then there is, an identity change as an anti-racist institution. So they're actually doing an analysis of, hey, what is systematic racism? Are there programs that we can focus on anti-racism training? Are there ways we can think about white privilege? And, are there ways that they develop accountability to oppressed communities? But the institutional structures still maintain that, there are still institutional structures that maintain sort of that privilege intact and relatively untouched. So anyway, so then it goes all the way to if it's so that was identity change. There's another one, which is structural change, where you're structurally changing the organization. And the last one is you're being fully inclusive. So you're in transformed inclusion and transformed society. And I would argue that there are very few that are sort of on that range. So I don't know if you can Google this, but it's continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural institution, but you can try to judge yourself and your organization on those things and think about, are there any policies that we're making that can help us dismantle some of this in the wider community. So.
That's really helpful. A lot of positive comments. I want to just make sure that you notice them in the chat. People thanking you for the insightful wisdom that you're sharing. I will say Dr. Vanessa McLeod from the Urban League is on, and she's joining us. And their organization, under her direction and her leadership, offers wonderful training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so a couple of the questions were from small businesses who said, you know, we are small, we have a very limited budget. She even mentions that there's some grants from the Legacy Foundation and some of our other community foundations for this kind of training, and includes her number and her email address in our chat. So if anyone is interested in bringing some of this training to your small or your large organization, the Urban League does a really great job. I think Dr. Rachel and I have both been part of those trainings, and they really, really great for a next step for some people who may be looking for that action step. So, I'm
sorry, I just want to, I didn't realize that Dr. V was on the call. Yes, I've actually participated. Dr. V did it for, I said the Lake Area United Way, and the training was fantastic. They had our group, we all watched Segregated by Design, which I highly recommend everybody watches, a 17-minute film. And we actually did some work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's, yeah, her organization does, you know, great work. So please definitely contact Dr. V. She's amazing.
Yes, she sure is. We're to the end of our time together. Again, Jennifer, you're on vacation, so we want you to return to the beach. And thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom and your leadership journey with us. You know, the word inspirational has been mentioned a few times by people in the chat, and truly you are inspirational, and you've taught us all some really good tools and skills and wisdom today. So thank you so much for that. Everyone, we appreciate you joining us at the Leadership Institute at Purdue Northwest. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I put in the chat our contact information if you want to reach out. Thank you so much. Jennifer, go have some fun.
Thank you so much, Shayla.